On the morning of February 27, 2026, a retired U.S. Air Force general walked out of his home in New Mexico, left his phone on a table, his glasses, and took his revolver. Nobody saw him live, nobody saw where he went, and as of today, nobody has found him. His name was William Neal McCasland. He held a doctorate from MIT and spent 33 years overseeing classified aerospace programs for the American military. That disappearance on its own would have been a strange story, but it wasn't the first. A few months earlier, in June 2025, a materials engineer from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory left for a hike in the Angeles National Forest with a companion. At some point along the trail, she fell behind. Her companion turned around and she was gone. Her name was Monica Reza. Before her, in 2024, a senior GPL scientist named Frank Maywald died. He had spent 2 decades working on Earth observation missions. Before him, in 2023, another GPL researcher named Michael David Hicks died at 59. He had contributed to SR mission and the DRT's experiment. When people started placing those names side by side, the list did not stop at 4. It grew to 11, then 12, each one with some connection. A reporter asked Donald Trump about it in a White House press briefing. "Some of them were very important people," Trump said. "We're going to look back at it." However, this story is way different than what the internet tells you. Let me show you why. February 27, 2026, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Susan McCasland picked up the phone and called 911. Her husband, General William McCasland, had walked out of their home and did not come back. She didn't know where he had gone. Local news picked up the story, and then, within 72 hours, something unexpected happened. People started connecting his name to other names. By the end of that week, a list was circulating on social media. Some versions had 9 names on it, others had 11. By April 2026, some versions had 14 names. The claim attached to that list was that these people had been silenced by someone or something. Let me introduce you to that list. Ning Lee was 78 years old and had spent decades at the University of Alabama. She had a physics doctorate and a very specific obsession: anti-gravity. She had founded a company called AC Gravity in the early 2000s and spent years trying to prove that rotating superconductors could produce small but measurable gravitational fields. Her work was fringed by the standards of mainstream physics, but it attracted attention from the US Army Research Laboratory, which funded some of her experiments. She eventually disappeared from public life in the early 2010s. Nobody outside her family knew much about what happened to her after that, and she died on July 27, 2021. The official cause was Alzheimer's disease. That death on its own made no headlines, until her name appeared on the list 5 years later that people began treating her death as something. Less than a year later, another name was added: Amy Eskridge. She was 34 years old and lived in Birmingham, Alabama. She was not a credentialed scientist. She was, by most accounts, an enthusiast, someone who spent considerable time researching anti-gravity technology and had made contact with several figures in the fringe physics community, including people who claimed to have worked on classified propulsion programs. On June 11, 2022, she died. The medical examiner ruled it a suicide. Her family released a public statement confirming that she had suffered from chronic pain for years and saying that they did not find her death unusual. Those who built the list did not accept that explanation. They pointed to her research, her context, her age, and a lot of things. They argued that a 34-year-old with access to sensitive information had been made to look like a suicide. In the summer of 2023, a third name appeared. Michael David Hicks was 59 years old and had worked for NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California for 25 years. He had published more than 80 peer-reviewed scientific papers and contributed to the Deep Space One mission in 2001. On July 30, 2023, he died. He was like 59 years old. No official cause of death was released. His passing was noted in a small astronomical bulletin and disappeared from public view almost immediately. The absence of information was the thing that drew attention. When someone digs into the official records and finds nothing, the gap itself becomes a story. His daughter later confirmed he had suffered from a chronic medical condition at the time of his death, and that the cause was heart disease, kept private at the family's request. His brother went further, stating publicly that he was appalled at watching his sibling's scientific legacy reduced to what he called a Bigfoot conspiracy theory. Matthew Sullivan had served the US Air Force and had died on May 12, 2024. He was added to the list because of his military affiliation and, in some versions of the narrative, because of the vague connections to aerospace research programs. The official cause of death was suicide. His family did not make any public statements connecting him to any brother pattern. 3 months later, another GPL researcher died. Frank Maywald was 61 years old and had spent 2 decades at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. His specialty was remote sensing, specifically the instruments that read the surface of planets from orbit to detect signs of biological activity. He was one of a small number of people in the world working on that program with real institutional resources behind him. His obituary was published quietly. It listed his name, his age, his career, and did not list the cause of death. Nothing else was disclosed. He died on July 4th, 2024. Joshua LeBlanc was 29 years old. He was an electrical engineer at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. He died on July 22, 2025, in a car accident. The investigation found nothing suspicious. Yet his name still appeared on the list. Anthony Chavez was 78 years old. He had worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory, the facility in New Mexico where, beginning in 1943, the US built its first nuclear weapons. By the time of his disappearance, he had been retired for years and was working as a construction foreman. He vanished on May 8, 2025. 14 days later, in the same region, another name was added to the record. Monica Reza was 60 years old and was anything but a peripheral figure at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. She was the director of the Materials Processing Group. In the 1990s, she had co-invented a nickel-based metal alloy called Mondalloy, specifically engineered to withstand combustion inside rocket engineers operating on pure high-pressure oxygen. That material was embedded in 12 components of the AR-1 rocket engine, built by Aerojet Rocketdyne. On July 22, 2025, she went for a hike at the Angeles National Forest with a companion. At some point along the trail, near a ridgeline, she fell behind. Nobody was found, and the search continued for weeks, yet nothing was found. 4 days after Reza vanished, another name was added. Melissa Cassius was 53 years old and worked as an assistant at Los Alamos National Laboratory. She disappeared on July 26, 2025. New Mexico State Police issued a statement supporting that account, saying it appears she had departed on her own. Her name appeared on the list anyway. Steven Garcia was 47 years old and worked as a contract property custodian at the Kansas City National Security Campus, a federal facility managed by Honeywell that manufactured components for nuclear weapons. He disappeared on August 28, 2025, and he's still listed as missing. By December 2025, the list had reached into the pharmaceutical and nuclear sectors. Jason Thomas was 45 years old and served as assistant director of the chemical biology at Novartis, the Swiss pharmaceutical company. His work centered on the development of cancer treatments. On December 12, 2025, he drowned at Lake Quannapowitt in Massachusetts. 3 days later, Thomas died. 3 days after Thomas died, Bruno Loureiro was shot at his home. Loureiro was 47 years old and held a position that most people in his field would consider the ceiling of academic achievement. He was a professor at MIT. He led the MIT Plasma Science and Fusion Center, one of the premier institutions in the world for research into nuclear fusion, the process that powers stars and that government has spent decades trying to replicate as an energy source. His work on plasma physics had been cited hundreds of times across the scientific literature. He was shot at his residence in Brookline on December 15, 2025. He died the following day. The investigation into his killing produced a name quickly: Claudio Valente, a Portuguese national who had studied physics at Brown University and who had been a contemporary of Loureiro at a different stage of their careers. The FBI and the U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts announced in April 2026 that Valente was solely responsible for the killing, and the case had no nexus to terrorism, and that the motive appeared to stem from personal and professional grievances that had built over years. Carl Grumar was 67 years old and had worked at Caltech for 30 years. His field was the structure of galaxies, the behavior of dark matter, and the search for water on planets outside the solar system. On the morning of February 16th, a neighbor found him shot dead on the porch of his home. The LA County Sheriff identified a suspect within hours. His name was Freddie Snyder, 29 years old, from the same rural area. Detectives found that he had trespassed on Gruma's property 2 months earlier, in December 2025, while carrying a rifle. Investigators said the two men did not know each other and that the shooting appeared to have escalated from a pattern of erratic criminal behavior from Snyder, not from any deliberate targeting. His widow said the conspiracy theory connecting her husband's death to a coordinated campaign was absolute nonsense and that he would have laughed at those promoting it. Within weeks, that list was everywhere. The FBI is still investigating. Now, let's examine what the official record says, what it refused to say, and what is really happening. Daniel List, who runs the YouTube channel Dark Journalists, assembled a list of people with any connection to government science who had died or gone missing. No statistical baseline was used on that list. Then, Jessica Krause, a Substack writer with over 1 million followers, amplified it. Then, it went viral. 14 weeks later, Fox News asked the White House press about it. The list is also wrong. The US aerospace and nuclear workforce exceeds 2 million people. In any 22-month period, ordinary mortality predicts at least 4,000 deaths, including about 70 homicides and 180 suicides. 5 people from those institutions on a list of 12 is far below statistical noise by at least 2 orders of magnitude. Now, let me explain why each case doesn't hold up. Ning Lee, she was on the list solely because the word anti-gravity appears in her biography. Nothing else sums up as suspicious. Michael Hicks, he was on the list because GPL doesn't issue public statements for routine staff deaths. Frank Maywald was on the list because of his connection to the conspiracy stems and entirely from the word biosignatures in his work, which the community associates with UFO cover-ups. Anthony Chavez was just a construction foreman and not a scientist. His only connection to the list is his address. He lived in Los Alamos. Monica Reza is the most genuinely unresolved case on the list. Her family has not endorsed any conspiracy theory whatsoever. Melissa Cassius is just an assistant and not a researcher. Steven Garcia is a contract property custodian. His top secret clearance was required for facility entry and not for access to classified research. Nuno Loureiro was on the list because of nuclear fusion, which sounds adjacent to nuclear weapons. It isn't. His shooter was identified, arrested, and also confessed to that, so there's nothing suspicious anymore. The widow of Carl Grumar called the theories about his death absolute nonsense, and his shooter had a documented history of escalating criminal behavior in the neighborhood. William McCasland, he had only held routine security clearances since retiring nearly 13 years ago, and his wife said so publicly. Jason Thomas was just a pharmaceutical biologist with no connection to government research whatsoever. He was just on the list because he worked in science. I suspect that the FBI will do an investigation, find nothing, and then the whole story will fade away. However, it will likely live on a conspiracy subculture, morphing over time to make the details seem even more impressive until there's a mostly false mythology about the dead scientists. This trajectory happened before, with the 1990 cluster of STI scientists and the early 2000s microbiologist deaths, with dozens of other appearing clusters that dissolved under statistical scrutiny. The theory peaks, The investigation finds nothing, and then the theory never fully disappears because its proponents do not require evidence to sustain it. However, there is one case I want to give special attention to. Her name was Amy Eskridge. She co-founded a company with her father, focused on what she called gravity modification research. Her father, Richard Eskridge, had a published paper with NASA on using nucleonic spin to modify gravitational fields using bismuth samples. She died on June 11, 2022. The Birmingham police classified her death as suicide by self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. In 2022, she appeared as a guest speaker on a History Channel program, specifically the Skinwalker edition of the series The Truth Is Out There. She discussed extraterrestrial intelligence and advanced propulsion. She described what she called ultra-terrestrials, entities she believed were humans from the future, moving backward through time. She died 4 months later after that appearance. On June 11, 2022, before her body was found, Amy sent a text message to a man named Frank Milburn. The message read, "Oh, by the way, if you see any report that I killed myself, I most definitely did not. If you see any report that I overdosed myself, I most definitely did not. If you see any report that I killed anyone else, I most definitely did not." She sent similar message to Samuel Wright, the CEO of a company called Geometric Energy Corporation. He and Eskridge had been working together on research she described as foundational to advanced propulsion. In April 2026, Wright posted screenshots of those messages on X. They showed a series of communication in the weeks before Eskridge's death, in which she described receiving death threats, described surveillance she believed was being conducted against her, and described physical symptoms she attributed to direct energy exposure. The other cases were way less believable. In Eskridge's case, the evidence has not been produced in any direction. The official position is that she took her own life. The documents supporting the position had not been released. No autopsy report has been made public, no investigation record has been released. This case, unlike the others, has not been resolved. That is either because the answer is uncomfortable, or because there is no answer yet, or because the question itself rests on claims that cannot be currently verified by anyone else outside a small circle of individuals who have chosen, for their own reasons, not to control what information reaches the public.